Hola, buenos dias. We are back. Millennial Mental Health Channel. Basically, I try and just use the intro as a chance to make Eddie laugh. Eddie, how you doing, my friend?
You hit your mark, so I'm pretty good with that. I'm feeling pretty good. What can I update you on? Oregon finally looks like fall. Literally, like last week, Friday came and we went from like 70 to 80 degree weather to now it's between 40 and 50, and it's raining and it's stormy, and fall is my favorite time of the year, so yeah. I'm not upset about it. So I think I'm feeling pretty good. How are you?
I'm doing really, really well. Something really cool happened. I know in the last episode, I know we mentioned that I'm having a child in the future, and we're naming him Eddie Carrillo Romano, obviously. But my wife and I were sitting on the couch the other day, and I had my hand on her belly, like I usually do when we're watching House of the Dragon, and I felt him kick. I felt just this little awesome. Tiny brush up against my palm, and it was the coolest thing I have ever experienced. So that was cool. So I've been riding high all week, just feeling that.
Hell yeah. Cool. That's way better than the weather here. That's way cooler.
Although I do love fall too, and I love Halloween.
And we're almost there. We don't even have. We were talking about at work what we're going to dress up as. I saw a tweet that was like, "This October is not Octobering like October usually does," and I'm like, "We're already at like Halloween, and I don't have a costume for work or anything, but we'll figure it out. That's okay."
Yeah, we'll wing it. I'm going as Cowardly Lion this year, so I'm pretty excited about that.
Oh, hell yeah. Dope. Well, I'm going to jump in front of you, Justin. I'm excited for today's episode. I want to start with shout-outs. The first shout-out is to the listeners. I mean, thank you guys so much. This past couple weeks, we've started to climb again in the U.S. charts as far as not only mental health podcast category, but for health and fitness, like the overall category. We peaked at 25 for all mental health podcasts in the United States, which is cool as fuck. And then we cracked the top 100 again for just the overall category of health and fitness. So thank you guys so much. We appreciate it. We wouldn't be here without you guys. Our last episode is the numbers look great. We're super hyped about that. So thank you guys. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for you. So thank you.
Yeah, and we recently got featured for the World Mental Health Day on the Spreaker platform, and after that we got an influx of a ton of new listeners. So if you're one of the new listeners that maybe heard about us from that, thanks for listening, thanks for being here, thanks for wanting to learn about mental health. And Eddie, what's your favorite one of our episodes to go tell new listeners to listen to?
Probably the first episode.
That's a joke.
Just kidding.
It took us a few episodes to hit our stride. Yeah.
No, it was okay. I was going to say, if you joined us, great. If you've been here from the beginning, thanks for sticking with us through the kinks and like trying to like work things out. I don't know what is. I don't really know if I have one. I'm going to say today's episode.
Perfect.
It's going to be the one I recommend to people. What do you recommend to people?
For some reason, the one that popped into my head was the Tourette's episode. That one was really good with Jeff Caturba.
Oh, yeah. Jeff was dope. Shout out Jeff. He's a friend of the show.
Yeah, shout out Jeff. He's the one that hooked me up with TED Talks, and then I'm giving the TED Talk in November. Yeah. He's a good dude.
Oh, I'm going to promote the shit out of that when it's out. So just
good.
Our listeners and followers, just be ready.
I've been practicing
One
every
more
day.
shout out I have. Oh, good.
I've been practicing the TED Talk every day.
I was going to say, what if you do a premiere episode and you just practice and you just record yourself practicing and then we just post that? No, it's okay. We'll save it for the real thing. One last shout out I have is one of my former students, Rachel. She actually reached out to me and gave us the idea for this topic. So we haven't said it yet. We're going to be talking about concussions. We did a football episode. We're in October, 8 months ago. I had to go scroll all the way back. It feels like we just did it, but it's been 8 months. We did an episode on football and CTE and just the impact that CTE is having on the sport as a whole and players and fans and everything. But we didn't talk too much about concussions, and I think that's good because it leaves us for an opportunity to talk about it today. We're going to focus on that. Some things have changed in the NFL since our football episode. Some scary shit has happened, so I think it's good that we talk about it, and we just give our listeners an idea of what else is going on.
Mm-hmm. I know we usually start off with a story time, but Ed, have you ever had a concussion? What do you think?
Yeah, yes. I think I mentioned on the last one.
Yeah,
this is a good reminder. I think I had one, but I didn't know until like 4 or 5 years later. And I remember I was at a football camp. I was warming up, and then next thing I know, I just immediately did not feel. I felt sick. I felt nauseous. Big headache, and I didn't know what was wrong. I didn't know what to do. I kept practicing at this camp we're at, and then that was kind of it. And then thankfully the symptoms went away. It was in the middle of summer, so I didn't have to think or anything. So I didn't notice any cognitive issues. I didn't notice any memory issues. But for sure that was a concussion, and I didn't realize it until I was in my intro to neuro class in college. And we're talking about the symptoms of a concussion. I was like, holy shit, I definitely had that. And that's not good that I kept practicing. And we'll tell you why in a little bit. But it's definitely not good to continue to participate after you've had a concussion.
Yes, I wish maybe the coaches would have said, hey, you've been concussed. Stay out of the game.
Well, I wish I would have known, like, about... I don't even know if I knew what a concussion was at that point. Like, I wish there was, like... trainings or something to tell kids of like, hey, if this happens, please tell somebody and we can figure this out, or we can like just tell somebody. But I don't think we even had that kind of education at that point.
No, I don't think we really do. Or education for the coaches. Hopefully they're doing that to spot a concussion. So starting off with what is a concussion? From the American Association of Neurological Surgeons, a concussion is an injury to the brain that results in temporary loss of normal brain function. Medically, it is defined as a clinical syndrome characterized by immediate and transient alterations in brain function, including alterations of mental status or level of consciousness that results from mechanical force or trauma.
Yeah. Some symptoms include a confusion, a headache. That's a huge one people talk about. Vision disturbances, so either double or blurry vision. Dizziness or imbalance. Nausea or vomiting. That was the one that I wish I would have known at the time. Mm-hmm. Ringing ears. Difficulty concentrating. Sensitivity to light, if you've ever heard of someone getting a concussion and needing to wear like sunglasses inside of a classroom or inside at home or at work. That's part of it. Loss of smell or taste, that would scare the crap out of me if that happened to me because of a head injury. Trouble falling asleep, and then that's like the tip of the iceberg. There's a ton of other things that could be part of it, but those are the main ones that people look for.
Yeah. The thing that I find pretty fascinating about concussions, about really anything with the brain, is that the brain is incredibly hard to get to. Like most organs we can study, we can look at, we can image, but with brain damage, it's really actually hard to see on imaging because the damage usually is at a microscopic level where cells are getting ruptured. It's not necessarily at a macro level and where you could actually see it on imaging. So what we know about concussions is actually not that much. You'd think that we would have all of this down. We'd have blood tests, but we're only at the very beginning stages of starting to be able to have blood tests for concussions.
Yeah. Concussion seems like one of those scary things of like, we think we know what we're doing, but we don't like necessarily always know. And I think the story that we're about to share gives a good example. So I'm going to go on a little bit of a monologue, if you will, for a little bit, just to set the stage for you guys. And this is really where today's episode inspiration came about. So think back about a month ago, actually a month and a day ago. It's September 25th, 2022. Tua Tagovailoa is the starting quarterback for the Miami Dolphins. He's been having a great year so far up until that point. People were excited about him. I think the Dolphins were like 3-0 at that point. So like, yeah, the Dolphins look good. We are rocking and rolling. He was in a game, I think it was against the Buffalo Bills. He was dropping back to throw a pass, threw the pass, gets hit by one of the defenders, and he immediately gets to the ground. As he's going to the ground, it looks like the back of his head slams onto the turf. He stands up. Immediately when he stands up, he like shakes his head around as if he's like, they call it shaking off the cobwebs. I think that's the, maybe not clinical term, but that's the term that people look out for in a football game or any other sport where a head injury could happen. So he gets up, shakes off the cobwebs, does it twice, and then he keeps kind of like jogging back to the huddle. He takes maybe 5 or 6 steps. As he's getting to the huddle, boom, his like legs collapse, and he looks like he's like a baby deer can't keep his balance, anything, gets down, catches himself before he could fall all the way, falls to almost one knee, gets back up, and then like one of his offensive linemen like grabs him and is like walking him back to the huddle. So that happens. I think the drive ended, whatever it was. He comes off the field. He misses the next drive, and then that was halftime. So this was in the first half. Misses the next drive. We go to halftime. Reports all over Twitter saying he had a back injury, which if you've watched football for a while, if you're someone that knows, not that I know a lot about concussions, but if you've seen concussions and stuff happen, you know that was not a back injury. They said it was a back injury. That's why he fell. It was not a back injury. So he leaves at half. He actually comes back, finishes the game. That's issue number one. Issue number two, 4 days later, September 29th, 2022, Tua and his team have another game, which is a whole issue by itself that the NFL still does Thursday night games. He's in the game. He, on a play, gets sacked. This time when he gets sacked, instead of getting pushed from somebody and then he falls, the defender grabs him, just doing his job, throws him to the ground, gets a sack. Defense is all excited. Tua immediately looks like he goes unconscious. He seizes up. His arms and his fingers immediately become rigid. His fingers are like, I don't remember what it's called, but his fingers just like, they almost look like they bend out of shape. Like they're not in a position that they should be. It looks terrible. He's on the ground motionless. He eventually like shifts to where he's on his back and he's laying there still with his hands and his fingers up and rigid. It looks awful. I wasn't even watching the game. I only turned to the game because Twitter was like going off on it. I turn on the game. I see it. It looks terrible. He's taken out in an ambulance. He goes to an ambulance, and then the rest of the game they talk about how like, oh, waiting to hear back from Tua, but sounds like he has movement in extremities, all that stuff, all this and that. So it was terrible to see because it was like it was something that once it settled, people were like, that definitely should have been. He should not have been playing today, but he was. The other piece to it is like there's supposed to be a third-party independent like concussion person on the sidelines that is like looking for these things and is able to rule somebody out. So the issue is that like one, Tua couldn't get himself out. He's a player. I mean, I can understand that. Like he doesn't want to miss a game, but Tua didn't have I guess didn't decide that he couldn't go in anymore. He's like, no, I can still play. His coaches decided, yes, he can still play. The team medical people decided he could still play. And then, like, nobody in the NFL, like any officials or anybody there, like, stopped him from playing. So necessarily, the NFL and the Dolphins got a lot of criticism since that incident. They said that Tua was clearly concussed in the first game. That was on the 25th, and he should have never been on the field for the second game. In the NFL, the concussion protocol is basically if you get concussed on Sunday, there's a chance for you to play the following Sunday, but you have to exhibit no symptoms for the next 7 days. And even that's not a great rule. It seems like too quick for people to be coming back. Because all of that has happened, there's a big concern for Tua. A lot of people also talked about the idea of second impact syndrome, or SIS. So basically it happens when the brain swells rapidly shortly after a person suffers a second concussion before symptoms from the earlier concussion have subsided. This event is rare, but when it does happen, it can be fatal. So that was really scary. People were like, that Tua might not be okay. Like, he might not ever get to do anything again. Spoiler alert, he came back last week and played, which I think is an issue by itself. I didn't think he'd play for the rest of the season, but that is that. And because all of that has happened, there's now what is called the, quote, Tua rule, which is an update to the NFL's concussion protocol that was jointly agreed upon between the league and the NFL Player Association. Basically, under the updated protocol, ataxia or gross motor instability, kind of like Tua when he got up, jogged, and like immediately lost his balance and fell to the ground, has been added to the list of no-go symptoms that would mandate immediate removal of a player from a game. And the other symptoms that are, quote, no-go include unconsciousness, confusion, and amnesia.
Excellent work, Eddie. Excellent work. Good recap. Yeah, that response where he just like lost control of his motor, we call that the fencing response. And it's just awful. It's awful to see. It's so hard to watch because it looks like they're writhing. It's just a really horrible thing.
Yeah.
I think the interesting thing to me is that his backup, Teddy Bridgewater, had a concussion as well. And he had to go out for a couple of games. After Teddy Bridgewater, because he was with the Broncos last year, he had a concussion last year too. So he is just racking up his concussion total. And that, man, it makes me so worried for him in the future and how much this is going to impact his brain.
The other piece to that, too, of Teddy Bridgewater is he was the first, I shouldn't say casualty, he was one of the first people to be impacted by the, quote, Tua rule. So they said the next week when he was playing that he had ataxia and when he was coming off the field, and they immediately took him out. He ended up saying he was fine. He passed concussion protocol, whatever it was. But he was, ironically, he was one of the first people to be impacted by the new rule. And I think there was something that said, like, more concussions have been reported since the Tua rule, or more people have been pulled out for concussion because of it, because of the more stricter kind of rules. Kind of segueing in, nerd alert. I'm still not from Justin. You can say it again when you share your stats. But I wanted to share something that I thought was really interesting. The NFL, if you remember our last episode, the NFL has pretty much kept fans and anyone interested in learning about injuries in the dark about what types of injuries are happening. It wasn't until 2015, or maybe even a little earlier, that they started like reporting and sharing the numbers to the public. So if you look up like number of ACL tears or number of Achilles tears or number of concussions in the NFL, you'll actually be directed to the NFL like player health website that gives you the numbers. Now, are they accurate because the NFL is presenting it? I don't know, but they're at least presenting us with some type of numbers. So, since 2015, the amount of concussions that's been diagnosed has actually been trending downward. So it was 275 that season in 2015. That includes the preseason and the regular season. I don't know about the postseason now that I think about it, but that could be an issue for later. And then in 2021, there was 187. So almost 100 down since then. Again, this was provided by the NFL. You accept the info. Whoever's listening, you accept it if you would like to. If not, it's okay to be skeptical. But some things that I want to share on why this might have happened or why we're trending downward is rule changes. So there used to be, and I know this firsthand because I was a part of it in high school for special teams, there used to be this thing called the wedge on kickoff. Basically, the team would kick the ball off. If you were on the receiving team, they'd kick it, and then like three people would jog back and make a wall or a wedge, if you will, in front of the returner, and they would literally just be a wall for anybody that just ran full speed, and they would try to like pick off the people trying to hit the returner. So they took that out. So I think that's been helpful. The other thing is that the kickoff position, so where, I don't remember where it used to be, but now I think they kick off from the 35-yard line. A lot of kickers in the NFL, probably all kickers in the NFL, but I think they choose whether or not to do it sometimes, can kick the ball straight through the end zone. Like, they don't even need to give the returner a chance. There's a lot more touchbacks, so that means there's a lot less people returning the ball, a lot less violence, which I think is good. Mm-hmm. Next is changes in helmet technology. Helmets have changed a ton since 2015. When did I start playing? I started playing in like 07, 08. Nobody even uses the helmet that I used back in the day anymore. Like, even the helmet I had in high school, nobody uses that. And I don't even think anybody uses the helmet that I used for my first few years in college anymore. And that was 2011 to 2014. So that's completely gone. There's been a stricter enforcement in things like roughing the passer and targeting, which I think has made players think a little bit and try to be a little more careful. So some of those things have come into play. Some of those things I think have impacted the number of concussions, but obviously it's not zero, so it's still an issue.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think one of the points we want to make on this is that, yes, you can make rule changes. Yes, you can make things a little bit better, but the game of football itself is inherently violent and is going to lead to head injuries. There's no way to completely avoid it, and that's what just kind of sucks. So, nerd alert! Sorry, I had to do it. There are actual multiple different types of brain injuries, of head injuries that come with any contact sport. Today we're talking about concussions, and these are oftentimes referred to as mild traumatic brain injuries, and these are the most common that we see in football, at least. These usually come after a big blow to the head, and usually you can fully recover from a concussion, at least from a functional standpoint. in a matter of weeks. So it helps, the stuff goes away after a couple of weeks. But there are more severe traumatic brain injuries that can happen, and they can lead to more long-term damage, such as like personality changes and significant psychiatric symptoms like depression, irritability, anger. Some people think that Antonio Brown, the wide receiver who's just kind of gone off the deep end, may have had a traumatic brain injury. There's some videos of him prior. It was the hit by Vontaze Burfict, one of the greatest names in the NFL. But before that, he was doing pretty good. He was smart. He was thoughtful. And then after that big hit from Vontaze Burfict, which we know did cause a concussion, his personality seemed to change a lot. So that's the thing, is that with all of these hits, your brain is just shaking around in your skull, and it's getting squished, it's getting pushed, it's being pulled. Your brain kind of floats in fluid that we call cerebrospinal fluid. But if it's going too fast, or if it shakes too much, it slams into your skull and causes damage and causes swelling. We talked a lot about this in the CTE episode, but it causes the blood vessels supplying your brain to get damaged as well. So one of the most... Oh, sorry, I lost my spot. So every contact sport has those issues with the brain shaking inside of your skull. And with the TBIs, how they can cause personality changes, which is kind of scary, it's because oftentimes what we call coup-counter-coup happens, where your brain gets forced into one direction really quickly, and your brain just kind of smashes into both ends of your skull, which typically will affect your frontal lobe. We talk a lot about the frontal lobe on the show because it has so many implications in mental health. But TBIs can take years to recover from, and sometimes people don't ever really fully recover from TBIs. You see that a lot in like car accidents, where there's a big heavy force and people slam into their steering wheels and their brain just goes back and forth inside of their skull. But that frontal lobe is like the brakes of your brain. So your brainstem just wants to have sex, fight, and eat. The frontal lobe is what controls those basic impulses. So when you lose that, you're just kind of acting on impulse. You can't control yourself as much, and you do a lot of stupid things. One study that I looked at from the American Academy of Neurology actually used a special imaging study, which was called a diffuse tensor MRI, I believe, that showed that 40% of retired NFL players had signs of previous traumatic brain injury. So more than just a concussion, like a bad brain injury, a TBI. It was also showed that players who played for an average of 7 years reported 8 concussions throughout their career. So a little more than 1 per year. And concussions and TBIs usually happen after a big hit. It's something that happens instantly. On the other hand, CTE is caused from repeated hits to the brain, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. So the chronic implies that it happens over time. And we talked a lot about that in our last episode, so go check out our last episode if you want to learn more about CTE. But essentially, it's a form of dementia that looks a lot like Alzheimer's histologically. So if you actually look at the brain tissue with a microscope, it looks like Alzheimer's. There are amyloid plaques, just like with Alzheimer's. And there can be lots of psychiatric and mental health issues with CTE. So yeah, check out our previous episode.
Yeah. Yeah, I think the important thing, too, to remember about concussions, like, just because we're talking about contact sports, or just because we're talking about like football, like, doesn't mean that like nobody else could potentially experience a concussion, right? Like I've seen a number of kids this school year that have gotten into a car accident, or that tripped and fell and they ended up with a concussion, or they were doing something else and weren't paying attention. They walked into a pole. I mean, that shit happens, and a concussion happens. Like it's important to remember that just because we're talking about Tua and the NFL and like the best football players that the world has to offer, doesn't mean that nobody else can get a concussion.
Yes, I think what separates football and why this is such a hot button issue is because they're so common in football, and oftentimes there's such a push to keep playing. I mean, there's money on the line, there's careers on the line, there's so much on the line that there's this pressure to go out and risk your brain, risk your life, essentially, to go out there and play again shortly after having a concussion.
Mm-hmm. One thing, too, that stuck out that night when I was like watching the broadcast was as it was happening, it must have been close to halftime, or maybe by the time I turned on the TV, it was close to halftime. But Richard Sherman was on the broadcast, like the halftime people. And if you don't know, Richard Sherman used to play for the Seattle Seahawks. I think he played for the 49ers for a little bit. Very well spoken, very intelligent man. Like he knows his shit. Like he will go on live TV and will make like analysts look dumb because they just don't do their homework, but he does. So I've respected what he has to say for a while, and when he talks, I tend to listen because he knows what he's talking about. The hard part is when that happened, when everything with Tua happened, he's in the middle of halftime show with the other commentators. He's talking about how like, oh, you know, I hope fans appreciate how much, you know, we go to war out here and we put our lives on the line and our bodies on the line, and I just really hope fans appreciate that, and people who watch the NFL, I hope you appreciate that. And that's really tough to hear because for a long time, Richard Sherman was someone who said Thursday night football games are stupid. We shouldn't have them. So for him to kind of like reverse and give this like an analysis in the middle of a game, now because he's being paid by Amazon Prime, who owns the Thursday night games this year, that was really disappointing. And I actually saw someone say something to him on Twitter, and he responded, and it just wasn't good enough for what I expect from him. So it's really tough. You mentioned it, Justin. It's tough that like a lot of these people's livelihood, the sport that they've known for the better part of their life, that gives them the ability to make this money and do what they love to do, is also the sport that's really fucking them up for later in life.
Totally. Which brings me to my next point. I wanted to talk a little bit about Demaryius Thomas. He was a former wide receiver for the Broncos. He was one of my favorite players. I remember exactly where I was when I heard that he became a Bronco when he was drafted. It was my freshman year of college. He was on the Super Bowl team with Peyton Manning. He actually holds the record for the most receptions in a Super Bowl, and the year they lost to the Seahawks in the Super Bowl.
Oh, shit.
And during his winning Super Bowl performance, so not the one where he held the record, but the one that he won, he took a huge hit and had a severe headache after the game and was unable to participate in the celebration for the Super Bowl. So imagine winning the Super Bowl, and instead of saying, oh, I'm going to Disneyland, it's like, I got to go lay down. Like, I feel sick. I feel like... And it was likely that he had a TBI, but there's no way to know after the fact. I don't think he was ever really officially diagnosed with a concussion or TBI at that time, but it's pretty obvious that he probably did. He had a car accident in 2019, and he cracked his head on the windshield of his car. And I was reading about the details of the car accident, and it just didn't make any sense. He was going like excessively fast. It was like, I don't know the exact numbers, but he was going like over 70 miles per hour in like a 30 or 40 mile per hour zone, which is pretty out of character for him. And I have a hunch that this is somehow related to his brain injury, but again, it is just a hunch. And this may be all related. So after that car accident in 2019, he started having seizures. So his brain was damaged enough to the point where, out of nowhere, he had never had seizures before and started having a seizure disorder, and started to withdraw socially as well. In December of 2021, he had a seizure while in the shower and he drowned. And this was only 6 months after he retired from football. Later, they did an autopsy on his brain, and it showed that he did have CTE. He had chronic traumatic encephalopathy, and he wasn't even 40 yet. So he was already having significant issues with CTE. And it just breaks my heart that this was probably the game he loved that started this downward spiral and led to his death. And Eddie and I talk about this, but we feel so conflicted because we love football. I mean, both of us played football. Eddie played a lot longer than me. I love the Broncos. I loved Demaryius. His football jersey was the only pro football jersey I've ever owned. It's still in my closet. And although I didn't really know him personally, all the reports from his teammates indicate that he was just the best of us. He was warm-hearted, he was loving, and he was a godly man who cared about his family and his teammates. And it just kills me that every Sunday we watch our favorite athletes destroying their brains for the sake of their pockets, for the sake of our entertainment. Like, it's tough. I know that John Oliver recently on his show last week tonight, he made a comment about, like, should football even be a thing anymore? Like, this is so dangerous for people. Should it even still be a thing? And I'm forced to wonder, maybe it shouldn't.
Yeah. I know a lot of people will watch and, like, will say stuff like, the sport is getting soft or blah, blah, blah. It's not as good as it used to be. And it makes me think that at some point it's probably not going to be around anymore. I don't have the numbers to back it up, but I feel like I've heard that, like, enrollment in youth football has gone down a lot over the years, which then means that, like, high schools are having less players, which then means that colleges are recruiting less players. And I think at some point it's probably going to get up to, it's going to be, what is it, where the rubber meets the road, where it's just not going to be the same that it is right now. And that sucks, because you said we both love the sport, but I think at some point, if football starts to fizzle out, I'll probably be okay with it, just for the sake of other people's safety.
Yeah, I agree. And, you know, we talked a lot about head injuries in the past, but one recent statistic that I found on the CDC, they've been studying youth football, and for a child in youth football, they have an average of 378 head impacts per player per season. 378 times your brain is rattling inside of your skull for a sport. Like, that breaks my heart just a wee bit.
Yeah. Well, and you think, too, I mean, that's one season. Someone starts playing when they're in 4th and 5th grade, and then they play. Even if they just played from 4th or 5th grade through high school, that's, you know, however many years, 8 years of playing. That, you know, if we do some quick math, what was that?
2,400,
400. Yep, that's tough.
Jeez.
Man. Well, let's discuss a little more in depth. We have our discussion questions. We have our first one. You were answering for Roger Goodell, Justin. Where does the league go from here?
Make more money. If I'm Roger Goodell, that's the only thing I care about. He's the commissioner of the NFL, if you guys don't know. Yeah. Where do we go from here? That's a great question. I don't think football is ever really going to be a completely safe sport. I think there are things we can do to mitigate the damage or reduce the damage long term. I did a little bit of research on what tests they're trying to make, because as of now, the assessment for concussions are clinical. You do a couple of tests, see how their brain's functioning, see how they're walking, but we don't really have any blood tests. We don't really have any imaging that we do. So I actually just saw that there was a recently approved FDA blood test. It's called Abbott's iStat TBI plasma. And essentially how it works is when your brain damages and cells rupture, it releases certain byproducts into your blood that you can potentially test for. But it said that this test will only really give you an answer on whether or not you should get a CT scan afterwards. So even then, it doesn't really give any definitive answers on, like, level of concussion, how bad it is. So we're still way behind on the measures. I think, you know, the NFL has done a big job of trying to change public perception and make people think that they're doing a really good job of reversing the trend of making things a lot better, but I just don't know if it's ever really going to get significantly better. Yeah, what do you think, Ed? Anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think back, my first thought when with this question is, this preseason, actually, we had a player on the Raiders who he caught a pass, like middle of the field, and he got hit as he was, like, going down, and, like, got hit pretty significantly in the head, but he popped right back up and, like, went back to the huddle. And I remember seeing a tweet that was like, in 2000, this man would have, like, died with the way his head was hit and the way he got hit on the field. So I think they seem to be trying a lot with these new helmets and trying to help out with having newer technology to help reduce the possibility of concussion and head injury. But again, like we've talked about, CTE is not necessarily who gets the most concussions. It's not necessarily who gets their bell rung the most. It's the chronic the chronic day after day, week after week, year after year of basically banging your head against another solid object. So I don't know. I don't know. I feel like I'd watch a flag football league, like if the NFL became flag football. I feel like I'd watch it, but it's the sport that we know and love is probably not going to be around for forever.
Yeah, and back to that CDC data on the head impacts for kids, it was way less. It was like 1/20th of the head impacts for a flag football league, or like even less. Like so, yeah, flag football is infinitely safer than tackle football, but that's pretty obvious. We probably didn't need to state the data on that one.
That's true.
What do you think? Did the Dolphins or Tua or NFL, did anyone screw up? What do you think? Yes, like all of them. I don't know. Like it's tough. Someone brought up a good point. It's like at what point do the Dolphins and the coach protect Tua from Tua? You know what I mean? Like at what point are they just like, no, just give us your helmet. Like you're done for today. Like, and I think the part that played into it honestly was that at the time they were winning and they were doing really well and like their offense was hot, and I had Jalen Waddle on my fantasy football team in another league, and he was scoring points. So that tells me that they were doing well. And I think the big piece of it was like, we can't stop now. We got to keep it rolling. So I don't know. I think unfortunately everybody played a part into it. I know one of the medical people got let go from the Dolphins like shortly after. They were probably the scapegoat. Unfortunately, I think other people deserve some punishment too. But I don't know. It's damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? Like who really should have stepped up, who didn't. Like it's tough. It is tough, and there are no easy answers in any of this. Well, I think some of our major take-home points for today is that football is a sport that is inherently hard on the brain.
Yes. Concussions are common, brain injuries are common, CTE, unfortunately, looks like it's also common.
Our methods for studying the brain are not good, and we're in the process of trying to develop better methods for diagnosing concussions and head injuries.
Yeah. And oftentimes we don't know how bad brain damage is from concussions because it is really hard to see on imaging, even if they get imaging. And currently there are no blood tests. It's tough. The concussions, I don't even know is this a shitty joke to make? Like, concussions have got to be the NFL, one of their biggest headaches. Like, no pun intended, yes pun intended. Like, it's the more that people get concussed, the more that those things go viral, the more that people are seeing, like, what is going on over there, the more that it looks bad on the league. So, yeah.
You cheesy dog.
Thank you, my friend, for thank you for wanting to discuss this with me. Thank you, Rachel, for the idea of the topic for the episode. It's I'm glad we can talk about it. I'm glad we're able to look more into it and not just like, I love football, it's fine. Like, I think it's good that we have the discussion.
Mm-hmm. I think one of our mottos for the show is question everything. And even though we love football, I mean, Eddie and I talk football on the show quite a bit, especially because our favorite teams play twice a year. But, man, we just hate that all our favorite players are slowly killing themselves every time they're on the field.
Yeah, exactly. Well, on that very positive note, that is it for today's episode. Thank you guys again for listening. Thank you for always listening. Thank you for getting us back up in those U.S. charts for Apple Podcasts. If you've made it this far, I've mentioned it the last few weeks, you know where to find us. But if for some reason you're new to the show and you just started at the very end, let me help you out a little bit. We're available on all streaming platforms for podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, all the other streaming platforms that they have. If you have Apple Podcasts, feel free to leave us a 5-star review. You can also leave us a comment if you would like to. On Spotify, you can leave us a 5-star review. We'd love to see that. Follow us on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok at Millennial MHC. You can send us your questions. You can send us your suggestions. You can send us whatever you like, as long as it's appropriate. Thank you guys for listening. Thank you guys for supporting us. We're a few weeks away from our 3-year anniversary. So thank you guys for getting us to this point. We love you. And as always, take care of y'all mentals.
Good night, Canada.